It was kind of an apt time to do this when, it's shameless plug, when we actually got Doxa. I think if you've ever been diving, you've probably seen a Doxa, you've worn a Doxa. For some of us around here, probably lost a Doxa to the ocean. So Doxa is actually a very prolific brand. When thinking about what we were going to do for the next talk, it was very obvious that we had to do something about dive watches. Now, we did a talk about water resistance and dive watches and stuff like that. So if you haven't seen that, go back to that on YouTube and you'll get the lowdown on the actual cases and stuff like that. But what's really cool today is that we've got two good friends here with James and Jason. Everyone knows that Jason is everywhere when it comes down to being underwater. James too, here and there, and I'm hoping at some point they'll come up and do some Pacific Northwest diving again.
Yes, please.
Yeah, there we go. So today's talk is not really about making a decision between a dive computer and a dive watch, because there really isn't a decision to be made there. But I think today's talk is more about sort of comparison of the two, the history and stuff like that, where the dive watch sits in the whole diving realm and where the computer is very obviously, and the benefits to that stuff. So what do you think, Jason? History of the dive watch and why we needed dive watches?
I think, when you look at dive watches versus dive computers, I think, as you said, there really isn't a choice. I think we all of us in the room enjoy wearing watches, so we'll always continue to wear dive watches and enjoy getting them underwater. But a dive computer has become something of a necessity for divers. And I like to think of this kind of long spectrum of development that started back in the 1950s with wristwatches that were built to serve a purpose for underwater explorers. And I think what we're seeing with dive computers now, and since the 1980s, is just the other end of that continuum. And so rather than see them as sort of competing interests, they're really it's an evolutionary sort of continuum. And the reason for their development in the first place, the dive watch, was that when scuba was invented and came into popular use back in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s, it quickly became apparent that there needed to be a reason or a means by which you could track elapsed time underwater, because the longer you stay at certain depths, your body overstays what are called no decompression limits. And the result of that is an ailment called decompression illness, where the nitrogen that's in the air that you're breathing under pressure gets into your tissues, and it just can't be respirated out quickly enough before you return to the surface. And it can then expand in your tissues, your bloodstream, your brain, your spine, your muscles, your joints, and cause serious illness, or in many cases, death. And so using a set of tables that some very smart people came up with to determine how long you could spend at each depth was the way around that. And in order to make that work, you had to have a way of, there we go. Yeah, there's a dive table right there. A way of tracking or keeping track of the amount of time you spent underwater. And the simplest way to do that was through the use of a diving watch. And, I've read sort of anecdotes about people that were timing dives before the advent of the rotating bezel on a dive watch, in which they would pop out the crown and set the minute hand to 12 before they would descend, and then just follow the minute hand around the dial to see how long they were under. For instance, if you think about a Panerai, which have been around since the World War II in the 30s and 40s, that's kind of a classic case. Now, I'm not sure how those were specifically used, But that's a watch that did not have a rotating bezel at first, and yet was made for divers. And you could use it to just keep track of elapsed time in a very simplified way. So when the diving watch as we know it came into being in 1953 with 2, maybe 3 brands, there's some dispute about Rolex's introduction, but Doxa, or sorry, not Doxa, Zodiac and Blancpain and Rolex with their watches. That's really when we saw the kickoff of what we know now as the dive watch.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. In the early days, divers for the US Navy would go down on stages. So it really was what would be considered a square profile for a dive, right? You start at the surface, you stand on this stage, you go down to a particular depth, you stay there for a period of time based on how long you could stay there, whether you were going to decompress on the way up, which often happened, but you were on a stage. Air was fed from the surface, right? So you were on what would be considered an umbilical, right? So here, the dive tables that we actually were using, especially when I first started diving, doing my courses through PADI, they have their dive tables, but it's all based on the US Navy dive tables, ultimately. So it's it looks fairly complicated, but it really isn't. Once you actually just understand how to read it, you can then start to plan your dive. And this is the big thing, going towards what Jason was saying, was that before you get in the water, you want to understand, where you're going and how long you're going to be there. For recreational divers, we're not just going down on a stage and staying in one place. As you've seen through hundreds of videos, you've seen people underwater. You're going to different depths. You're going shallower, going deeper. It's never actually a square profile. So these were actually made very conservatively just to make sure that unless something untoward happened, you'd be really quite safe, right? So the dive computer just took off from that, right? Just taking those dive tables and being able to monitor accurately your depth to then give you feedback audibly and visibly through staring at the screen to follow along. The other nice thing about that was, too, it's an instant dive log. In the old days, you'd write down your profiles and stuff like that, the amount of time that you were underwater, so you're using a watch ultimately for that. And you had a manual dive log. Well, now your computer does everything. Just plug it into your computer, you can offload that data, and you've got an absolutely bulletproof record of where you've actually been, right? And how long you've been there for, which I think is fantastic. The rotating bezel is another interesting thing when it comes down to dive watches, because you don't really want to overstay your welcome, right? It's one of those things that you're down there for a particular amount of time because you figured out how long you could potentially be there based on the maximum depth you've gone to. And as long as your watch doesn't let water in, your bezel would tell you exactly how long you've been down there for. Some bezels are really interesting in that, Doxa developed the no decompression limit scale and put it on your watch, right? So it was very easy when you didn't have a computer, you could just turn the bezel around to where you needed to go. And of course it's one directional, so you're not going to get more time than you actually think you have, right? And you can see what your no decompression limits are. So a very safe way to go about diving. So James, you've done some diving. What's your favorite dive watch?
Sorry, the last word was dive watch or computer?
What's your favorite dive watch?
Oh, I think I got to be true to the roots. It's like just pick a Seiko. When I first started diving, it was my SKX, my 007, which my father has now, and I probably put my first 15 or 20 dives on that. When Heaton and I dove Kelvin Grove, not too far from where you guys are all sitting today, I was wearing a 777, which is hard to beat. I mean, as a watch that actually feels like a watch that you could use as a dive computer or a tool dive watch. It's big. The lume is incredible. If you get down, 30 meters on Kelvin, it's pretty dark. That's a flashlight dive, even on a nice sunny day. And you glance down and have that on one wrist is pretty nice, especially because at the time I was using a pretty basic computer, a Sunto Zoop, which looks like essentially a hockey puck with a screen on the top of it and a giant elastic to hold it to your wrist. Really great dive computer if anybody in the audience is looking to get into diving. But no backlight on that, kind of hard to read. You had to charge it. It has like a phospho layer on it. And just if you just wanted a glance to know how long have I been on the wall trying to find an octopus, the Seiko's better for that, I would say. Since then, I've moved into kind of, I think like a lot of people, more modern dive computers, especially the stuff from Garmin, which is, viewable at almost any angle, has an incredible backlight, all that kind of stuff. So that tech has certainly evolved over time. But I mean, today it'd be the Pelagos or the I've got a Doxa on now, 300 50th anniversary. Those are the ones that I like to dive with when I can. The last time I was, that I did a ton of diving, it was with my Pelagos 39.
And Jason, how many dive watches have you actually dove with? There was an article recently, right? But
we should have clarified in the title that it wasn't all at one time, the 200 or whatever it was. There's only so it's that Nick Hayek Jr. thing, but you get them all the way up to your elbows.
Or the guy on the street corner selling, you open up your wetsuit jacket and you've got
you got it clipped on.
Yeah. No, I think it's well over 200 different watches that I've had diving. I started to do this tally, and looking back, I probably should have started the spreadsheet at some point. But it's multiples from each brand, and those add up pretty quickly. In terms of a favorite, I always tell people, like, when people say, what's the best dive watch? I'm just like, look, whatever one you have on your wrist and you're going to have fun with and have a great adventure with, that's the one. It's kind of like that adage about, the best camera is the one you're carrying or the one on your phone or whatever. And I just think, look, my go-to phrase is that dive watches are blunt instruments, and that the makers that built them back in the 50s kind of got it right the first time around. It's kind of hard to beat a good, black and white dialed, rotating bezel, anything from the late 50s on. I think they've gotten better in terms of materials and accuracy and water resistance and all of that stuff. But they've all kind of done a really good job for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, for anybody in the audience that maybe doesn't dive or whatever, the difference, if you really want to picture the difference between a computer and the dive watch that you love, it's an abacus to a calculator. That's kind of what it is. They're going to do a similar thing, and in the right hands, they largely will cover the same bases, but there's a huge amount of automation that comes in with it, especially the modern stuff. I mean, for me, there's like a lot of tech has changed in the last 10, 20 years for us, everybody. But it's kind of wild to look at what the kind of standard for dive watches was a decade ago versus today. There's been huge leaps in the tech used in the field. It's there's some really amazing stuff on the market right now, and huge uptake from brands you wouldn't expect. Like, who had it on their bingo card 3 years ago when Apple launched a dive watch? Nobody would be my guess, right? That wasn't in the script. Pretty wild though, and a great partner. And then that partner has led to one of the best cases you can put your phone in. Jason and I use them for professional shoots with frequency. It's been a great time to be a diver the last decade for sure.
What has been the dive watch that you've ever taken on a dive that you really disliked the most? That's been like a toy dive watch.
Mine, this is going to upset some people, and it's a watch I adore. But I dove a couple times with my 2254 Omega, which I think is literally almost a perfect watch, except for one flaw. The bezel's so slippery. So you get in the water with this gorgeous dive watch, sword hands, wave dial, looked incredible. And you're like, all right, we're about to go down, and you go to do, and you're like, nope. And you finally just give up. You go like, well, again, we're going computer this time. I wasn't going to be able to turn it with gloves on for sure. But other than that, I mean, most of them, if the bezel turns and they keep decent enough time, within a minute, an hour, you're probably good.
Yeah. It's tough to pick dislikes, but to James's point, I think with a watch, any watch, or especially a dive watch, there are certain basic touch points to them, like literal touch points, tactile touch points, like the strap and the bezel and the legibility. And I think for me, so much of what defines a dive watch, the calling card, if you will, is the bezel. And so that just has to work well. And I think as much as I love the aesthetics of a twin crown dive watch, now today I'm wearing a Christopher Ward Super-compressor, which is a gorgeous watch, really well made. It's got some interesting features to it, but it has a crown that controls the inner rotating timing ring. And every time I've used a watch with an internal bezel and a separate crown for rotating that, it's been a challenge. They're just not well suited, I think, for actual use. Whether or not you're wearing gloves, that's always kind of the cliche that we use in the dive watch review space is, how does it turn with gloves on? Well, when you have a very small crown and it's strapped on tightly to your wrist, it's hard to manipulate that. As well as there's a bit of a risk, Jason, as a watchmaker, you can probably speak to this more than I can, but of turning something that has a seal underwater. And I do a lot of use of a bezel underwater for various things, and to manipulate that is a bit risky when you're at depth with water ingress.
Yeah, I think that brings up a really good point. How you can actually turn that bezel underwater is important, especially if you're a cold water diver, because a lot of divers up around here won't necessarily wear gloves; they'll wear mitts. So you have your thumb and your index finger, and the rest of your other fingers are in one pouch. So you're only able to sort of grab something with two fingers, like a crab, right? So actually having that ability to where you've got grip on a bezel, it's really, really important, I think, at that point. And yeah, to Jason's point, anytime that you're actually turning a crown or pressing a button underwater, it's dangerous, right? But even with complicated locking mechanisms for your crown, like I used to own a 70s Pro Cloth, and I can't tell you every single time I actually went diving, I had to dry the thing out afterwards, right? It had such an interesting dial too, because it was so completely bubbled from all the moisture that had got into it. So, it's another thing to think about with your dive watch if you're actually going to take a dive watch underwater. And I think you should take a dive watch underwater, because it's really good to have some form of redundancy.
Also, I think that Heaton and I really appreciate it. It's a very rare spec if you're a watch writer, pundit, whatever, but it's a very rare spec. But about once a year, maybe, Jason, a brand launches a watch and actually says the pushers can be used underwater or they can't. Like Blancpain, if they make a dive watch that has a function, they'll almost always say yes or no. Or like, you can push this pusher at 5 meters, but not at 50. And then I think Chronosport with the new Eclipse UDT, Momentum with the new Eclipse UDT, that's a Vancouver brand there. They said that, the two pushers have like Daytona style screw down crowns. And they said it's water resistant to a certain amount, maybe 50 meters with them open. And then if you want to go below that, which of course, if you don't know you're diving, kind of the floor for most people diving is going to be 40 meters. 30 is much more common, I would say, with most recreational diving. And then once they're screwed down, you get the 200 or whatever. So I always love it when that element is included. I became fascinated. This is a very long time ago, but I think, Jason, you had one of those aquagraphs, the tags.
Oh, yeah.
Because they had a full rubber sleeve over the two pushers, and I believe that could be operated at its running depth.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody's taking that watch to 200 meters or whatever, but still. I love that stuff. That's rad.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you find yourself there, something very wrong has happened.
The watch doesn't matter at that point.
No, it doesn't, no.
It'll be fine. You won't.
Unless you're wearing a Newtsuit.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, the Newtsuit. Yeah, we could bring that up. Well, we're very lucky today to have another couple of very special people in my life. But one particular person, Virginia, is the daughter of Phil Newton. And for anyone here in Vancouver that's ever heard of Phil or the Newtsuit, he was the developer of that and other submersibles and things like that. So I got a question for you. How do you fit a watch over the top of a Newtsuit? That's a long NATO. Yeah. So these are the things, right? We've got a very, very big history of diving up here, and the waters up here are just amazing. Just out of curiosity, now I'm seeing so many people in it. How many people are divers here?
Oh, that's awesome. Everybody who doesn't have their hand up, give it a try.
Oh, we got more people over there too. I know Mary was sticking her hand up there. And Scott too.
Diving locker on West 8th, guys. It's great. They'll take care of you.
Yeah.
Say hi to Teresa.
When you're diving in a Newtsuit, that's all computerized now for what you're seeing and controlled up at the surface. Yeah.
You have two very nice people on the system doing all this stuff for you constantly over here, and you don't have to watch those things, and it's what atmosphere. So
Yeah.
you're dealing with you.
Yeah. There's two tenders that are at the surface that are assisting with each diver, I guess. And it's a 1 atmosphere suit, so you're never having to really be concerned about decompression sickness, right? So that it's an amazing thing. When you actually have seen one up close and you see the complexity of it, of all the moving joints, and even to actually get for those guys, get the hand moving like this, right? It's pretty amazing. It really is. So we're very fortunate to have that company over here, and your dad, who passed away recently, was just amazing for all of that stuff. And if any of you have not watched the movie The Abyss yet, you have to. It's one of those dive movies that divers just flock around, right? It's an absolute classic. But the submersibles there, right, were Phil's submersibles and Newtco's submersibles. So a big history there. When you actually get into a submersible, it's very different to what you might imagine. There, it's the perfect place, I think, for a dive watch, because it's not getting wet unless something bad happens. But
something bad happens very quickly.
Yeah, sure. These submersibles are very confined spaces, right? When I sat in one once, and I was actually quite shocked. You don't want to be claustrophobic. You can't do that. And I would imagine the same thing with the Newtsuit too. Yeah. Is there room for a watch on a wrist for a person in the suit?
You actually, if you're small enough, you can actually withdraw your arms into the suit and work on the controls inside. So you could actually see your watch. But of course, when you've got your arms out in the arms of the suit, you really big sea watch, that would be either exterior,
Yeah.
external, or
So what Virginia was saying is that the suit is big enough for you to be able to take your arms, your physical arms, out of the arms of the suit while you're in the middle of a dive. So you can get those right in front of you, so to be able to get to the controls on the inside too. So which is very interesting. So you can wear a watch inside a Newtsuit. I never knew that. At this point, I think we can see that the dive computer certainly is one of those things that is a must-have for a dive, for your own safety. Having a redundancy is absolutely fantastic, and I think necessary. It's always good to have the bailouts there if should you ever need them.
Jason, I think it's an important point to make when you talk about redundancy. And some people think just having a dive watch on their opposite wrist is redundancy, but if your dive computer fails for whatever reason, you really have two things that you have to keep track of. One is time, which the watch covers, but you also have depth. And if you lose your dive computer for whatever reason, you need a backup depth gauge as well. So if you happen to be lucky enough to have one of these great dive watches that have an integrated depth gauge, like a few do, you're well set there. But if not, you will need a traditional analog depth gauge to be able to track your depth as well. And I do have one that I use on occasion that provides true redundancy. And I think a dive watch, even beyond the redundancy part of it, for a backup is useful for so many other things that you want to time during a dive, whether you're using it for navigation or turnaround times. These are things that dive computers don't do very well, because the screen is so focused on telling you the current information that to get to a stopwatch screen or an elapsed time screen or something like that is a little bit more difficult. So definitely a dive watch isn't just for show.
The other thing about diving too is that as I found as I've got older, I have to wear glasses to see anything close. So I don't know, like I was very lucky for this last set of dives to actually figure out, they have little pieces of lenses that you can stick on the inside of your mask so you can actually read these things. I have to say though, I was tending to look, when I did the dives that we did the video from, I was tending to look at my watch more than my dive computer, because it was actually, the dive computer was actually harder to read for me with these bifocals. Even in there, I could see my watch really clearly. But yeah, that's another aspect of taking into consideration eyesight for dive computers. So dive computers come in all kinds of different sizes. Some of them look like wristwatches. Some of them look like mini tablets that you can that's on your wrist. Jason, do you have a preference for a style of computer that you really like?
Yeah, I'm not a console person. So for those not familiar, a console style dive computer is a kind that's actually on a tether, often connected to your regulator, or, Jason, as you mentioned, like this sort of tablet style, like where it's kind of a big thing that you strap on your forearm. I tend to prefer kind of more of the wristwatch style, and my go-to for the past few years has been the Garmin Descent family. I've had a Mark 1 and now a Mark 2. James is holding up the G1 Solar Descent, a smaller one that is even more watch-like and daily wearable if you want to go that route.
It's like wearing a G-Shock.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Awesome.
I recently tried an exciting one. It was the latest from Suunto, and I used to be a Suunto guy. I had a D9 and then a Gecko, they used to call it. It was before they called it the Zoop, they called it the Gecko. And I recently got a chance to test out a Suunto Ocean, which is their kind of Garmin competitor. And it's a really great dive computer for a number of reasons. But one of the neat features was that in addition to your dive log afterwards, it actually was able to show a 3D
This is super
track
cool.
of your dive path. So your entire profile was shown in 3D, and you could spin it around 360 degrees and look at it and zoom in and out, and it would show you the track of your dive, including the depth profile, in kind of a 360 degree 3D fashion. And it made me think that I think the holy grail of dive computer development that we haven't seen yet is underwater navigation. When we navigate underwater, it's this 360 degree, very disorienting environment. And you're taught early on to use a compass and take a heading, time your swim kicks, which is another good use of a dive watch. But if Suunto's able to kind of track your profile and show it later, I can't help but think they or Garmin or somebody is going to be pretty close to coming up with some form of underwater navigation that's reliable enough that when you set off on a dive, you don't have to worry so much about getting back where you started, which is always a bit of a concern, especially in disorienting or murky water. But to answer your question in a shorter answer, Garmin is my go-to these days.
We had the gentleman that developed that led the team that developed the Garmin dive platform on the Grey NATO, and he was saying that they're very interested in the idea of not only navigating while you're diving, but if you're diving with other people, like Garmin, and I'm sure other brands, but definitely Garmin has the ability to track multiple tanks. So if you're an instructor or leading a thing, you can actually have all of your group's tanks pressure listed on your watch. So no more time check-ins, or maybe, let's be clear, you never give up doing time check-ins. You might do fewer on the dive, depending on the setup. And he said they were very interested in trying to find a way to add into that the ability to locate a specific diver, and that would probably require some sort of a surface to water barrier, something to permeate. So could be a buoy, a beacon, something like that. It'd be really cool if once they figure it out.
Yeah, that brings up a very important point, especially from the point of view of the dive computer and having those kinds of electronics available to you, especially when diving in low visibility, which we tend to get up here in the Pacific Northwest quite a bit. The other thing too is night dives. Actually using your watch as that navigation tool, and talk about disorienting. Actually being underwater with nothing but your flashlight or torch, right, to see what's in front of you. It's a pretty crazy thing. I think something similar to that would be going into a cenote or a cave for that kind of an environment. So the lume on the dive watch is really, really important. I mean, dive gauges have been backlit lumed for many years. So that's not a problem. But out here, as soon as you start to get to a depth of about 50, 60 feet, the light diminishes quite quickly. So actually having good lume on a dive watch is really, really helpful, right? From your guys' perspective, what watch have you found that dive watch has had the best lume?
I mean, Seiko and Rolex, probably. The Doxa, the markers are quite small. Mm-hmm. Vertex is ridiculous.
Amazing. Yeah.
That M60 is like one of the most impressive dive watches under $5,000. It's just that's an incredible watch.
I agree. And I think if you go to something like a marathon, it's not bright lume, but it's constant, and it's easy to tell. I think your the point about and this is a bit of a tangent, not strictly with lume, but with legibility. That's just one of the basic needs of a dive watch is legibility in all conditions. And I oftentimes we hear about, especially with Doxa, this kind of apocryphal story about how they developed orange as the easiest color to read underwater in murky conditions. And those of us that dive know that orange is actually a color that fades to gray in about 15 feet of water. So I think that's a bit of a strange tale, but we love colorful watches for other reasons. And I think when people say, what is the best color watch for underwater? And my point is that when it comes to underwater legibility, or any legibility really, the best is going to be white markers on a black dial, or maybe black dials on a white dial. But the point is that with a dive watch, really all that's important is the bezel and the minute hand. An hour hand, as we know from Doxa with the dwarf hour hand, is largely vestigial. You don't really need it to track a dive time. The dial markings, unless you really need to know the time of day when you're underwater, which for an hour-long dive, I mean, if you can't remember roughly what time it is, you're probably have bigger problems. So for me, the simple kind of white and black dive watch with a good legible bezel and a big minute hand is the way to go.
So I thought what we could do now is, it's probably, with a lot of people here to see you guys, we could open this up to questions for you both, right? Just so we know, are there any topics you want to avoid?
No.
Fair game here.
Okay, who wants to be the first person with a question?
Well, Jason brought up his Christopher Ward super-compressor. Can somebody comment on super-compressor technology?
Yeah, you brought up, Jason, the super-compressor. Do you want to make a comment on super-compressor technology?
Sure. I think it's a fascinating bit of dive watch history, because what I love about the dive watch is it's a continuing example of how watchmakers are solving problems. And whether it's locking bezels like on your Ploprof, expanding clasps, markings on the bezel for no deco or decompression, like there's a decompression scale on the dial of this Christopher Ward. But I think the super-compressor came at a time when sealing technology was good. I mean, we had watches, this is mid to late 60s, we had watches that could go certainly to 200 meters reliably, but the gasket materials were different, the kind of tolerances of case development were different. And so what Irvin Piqueret, or EPSA as we know it, the company that developed the super-compressor technology, did was they developed two styles of case, one with kind of a bayonet style, push down, click and twist to lock it, and then one that had a spring integrated into the case back that would actually, the concept was that the case would actually seal tighter the deeper you went. And I always found that a little bit strange, because I thought, well, what happens if you're doing shallow diving? Like, is your watch more susceptible to leaking? But I think the point was that it was developed at a time when case sealing was not as reliable as we know it is nowadays. Nowadays, you probably don't need super-compressor technology to seal a dive watch. That's why we don't see it very often. But I think it's this kind of sliver of history that is well known, and that people admire for that little window into what engineers and watchmakers were tinkering with back then.
Okay, good. Next question. Anyone? Yes.
How are helium escape valves supposed to be used in diving methods?
Okay. So the question is about helium or gas escape valves and how they're supposed to be used.
This is the silliest, most misunderstood piece of equipment in the dive watch world, I think. Maybe in the watch world period, like totally misunderstood for what it's for and what it does. Obviously, a lot of divers will understand, but Jason, will give people the rundown on why an HEV probably isn't required for your next vacation dive watch, even if you want to spend big money.
Yeah, I mean, it's again like the super-compressor case. This was a technology that was developed for very specific use back in the late 60s. Thought to be by Doxa and Rolex, kind of in tandem. And it came about because as divers were starting to be used for underwater work or military purposes, and living in hyperbaric chambers and then diving out of a diving bell at great depths, they had to live for days and weeks at a time in a pressurized, dry environment inside of one of these hyperbaric chambers. And if they were wearing a watch, the helium that was in the mix of gas that they were breathing, oftentimes trimix or most likely heliox, which is helium and oxygen, replacing that nitrogen that causes decompression sickness and narcosis, helium atoms are very small, and they had a tendency to seep past the gaskets into a watch and would collect inside of the watch while these divers were in a dry environment in the hyperbaric chamber for days and weeks at a time. And then as they were decompressed back to surface pressure as they were finishing their shift, so to speak, those helium atoms would get bigger and bigger and bigger because they were expanding under less pressure, and didn't have anywhere to go, and they would pop the crystal off of the watch and ruin the watch, sometimes the movement, the crown, etc. So this one-way overpressure valve was developed and put on the side of the watch to mitigate that. And I'm guessing none of those of you in the room, or James and I for sure, and probably 99.9% of divers in the world will ever experience that or be in a hyperbaric chamber for work purposes, hopefully not for recuperative purposes either. So we don't have to worry about that. But watch companies seem to think that that is an emblem of the ultimate in a dive watch, because then I guess you could use it anywhere without fear. So
I kind of like, I understand putting the feature on a pro watch. I get it. The top level professional divers these days are probably sat divers, commercial divers. But the way that it's marketed and the way that it's spoken about within this industry is just so wildly misunderstood. It can be sometimes comical. It's not a feature that most of us need, for sure.
Yeah, the other aspect of it is the physical point of having a hole in your watch that's stuffed with a pressure release valve. It's another point of entry in for water if it were to fail, right? So it is something that, you know, those actually have to be serviced as well, right? Which there's in the watch world, unless you're in a service center, it is one of those things that, you know, there's not a lot of information about servicing them. You know, from the point of view of Rolex, yeah, they've got tools to remove them and things like that. But it also brings up another point, sort of for points of ingress and failure, is just like with Zinn that has the AL technology with a little desiccant capsule in it. Again, it works really well, but it is another place that can fail. And, you know, Murphy's Law is always the case where, you know, when you least expect it, it will happen. And then, yeah, then you're bringing watches into us and we're drying them out, things like that. So we don't want that. We really don't. I've seen the heartbreak on people's faces when they brought their watch in.
You know, when we're talking about sealing and water ingress and points of failure, I have an interesting anecdote that James reminded me of, and that is a few years back I was diving with the great oceanographer Sylvia Earle. Yeah, her deepness. We were diving in Mexico, and I was wearing the new, at the time, 43 millimeter Sea Dweller from Rolex, and she had on a small gold Datejust. And it's her watch of choice. She liked wearing it. And we went for this dive and came back on the boat, and we were taking off our gear, and I looked across, and her Datejust on her wrist, the crown was popped out. It wasn't even screwed in. It was actually out. And I mentioned it to her, and she said, she kind of was taken aback. She just quickly kind of adjusted it, screwed it down, and off we went. And I found that to be such a poignant sort of story about not only Sylvia Earle in the fact that for her, her watch is just part of her equipment. She doesn't baby it. She maybe doesn't pay a lot of attention to it, but also to her faith in Rolex and the fact that Rolex was able to make a watch that could survive. We were probably at 20 meters or so it wasn't terribly deep, but still, this is a dress watch, not a dive watch, with the crown unscrewed, and did just fine and didn't leak. And when I brought it up to the Rolex marketing person on the trip and said I wanted to include that tidbit in my future story on Hodinkee, they were sort of hesitant, and then the next day said, "Please don't include that in the story. We'd rather you not." And I thought I think they just either maybe were trying to preserve Sylvia's reputation as if this was some careless thing on her part or whatever. But I thought it had the opposite effect. I was very impressed by the fact that the watch didn't leak, but that Sylvia didn't seem to care.
I can't lie here. I mean, there have been times I've put watches into our pressure tester and I forgot to screw down the crown. And they have passed. Yeah. So with a low pressure test, yeah. But
I have a Planet Ocean, and Omega claims the helium escape valve is good to 50 meters over. Still waterproof, they claim, I believe.
So on the Planet Ocean, someone was just saying that they know that that even if the crown on the helium escape valve on that watch was open, it's good to 50 meters.
I believe so.
No, I don't know, but yeah. So that goes to show you there's a lot to be said about sealing technologies, right? For whatever it is, anything that's going underwater, a lot of engineering time is put into that. As I'm sure you can attest to with the Newtsuit. You don't want to spring a leak in that, for sure. Any other questions that people have? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. My question's for both Jason and James. So we started a bit of a group in Vancouver for young watch enthusiasts. Now just wanting their take on kind of the younger generation getting into watches and really diving in general, to be honest with you. As two people who are very involved in the industry and have been for a very long time.
James, I'll let you take that one. You're younger than me.
I got a couple. You got a couple years on me. But yeah, I think the last few years have been really good. As far as I think, let me dial that back. If you're a deep collector / enthusiast, I'm not a collector, I'm much more an enthusiast. But if you're a deep enthusiast, the last few years have been a bummer. Watches have been hard to buy. Brands don't seem to respect their potential buying audience, the rest of it. I do, though, think there's the underside of that is if you're just getting into this and you're relatively new to the hobby, the strength of the sub $1,000 segment, I would argue, has never been better. It's maybe a little bit more boring than it was a few years ago, but it's really good. The quality's really good. You can go a really long way on a reasonable amount of money with a watch, diving or otherwise. I think that Instagram has really opened the doors where all of a sudden you have the ability to know that there's a Red Bar group in your city or otherwise. Whereas, even not that long ago, you would have had to have been on the right Watch You Seek channel or been invited by somebody, right? And if it's, look, I love small communities. I love really tight-knit groups. All of that's really valuable. But if you don't even know that there's a Red Bar 30 minutes from where you live, that doesn't work, right? And I think it's cool that that brand, if we'll use it that way, is like global. But I think the last few years have been a really good time to be getting into watch. I think it's a really tough time to be someone who's kind of at their apex and wanted to maybe check out their first brand new Rolex, which you can't, which doesn't seem fair or normal or not unfair, fair, who cares? It's a luxury product, but it just doesn't feel normal. Like most things are, if you're in the right space, are around. So I think it's, while it's been a tough time maybe to be, a little deeper into the hobby, I think it's been a really interesting time to get into it. The Moon Swatch, I think, has exploded. Younger millennial and even beyond that attention on watches. I would get messages from people who knew that I knew or like watches but we're otherwise like deeply Apple Watch or really nothing, no watch people. And they'd be asking about these watches. And I think the Scuba 50 does a nice job with that as well. I still think that's a lot of fun to be had for $400. But yeah, I think that the internet really blew out a lot of doors that used to be kind of closed, or you needed a password. You needed to know what to say to be part of the team, part of the group, that sort of thing. And I think the more you can do to do events like this at Roldorf that you guys are attending live, I think there's huge value there. That's my favorite part of this watch world, and I think I'm speaking for Jason as well. Actually, I'll be clear, both Jasons on this call. But the coolest part of the dive watch world is that you meet other people who love to dive, love dive watch, love dive gear, love talking about their best dive, their worst dive. And you can do that when you're not diving. Like, you need something to do when you're not diving. We can't all be diving all the time. We're not all Jason Heaton. So I mean, it's helpful. It's helpful to kind of have a community around these things. And I think personally, it's been a really cool time in the last, let's call it 5 years, to be getting into watches, because I mean, look, as long as I work in this industry, I don't think we'll have another 2021, 2022 in terms of the level of attention on watches. And I assume other hobbies. I saw this in cars. I saw this in video games. I saw it in a bunch of different things. But for our world, watches, and you could still dive in that era, because it's largely a sport you do on your own, literally with your own air supply, which is a plus. But yeah, I think it's been an interesting time to get into watches, and it's hard for me to imagine what it was like. I got in about 2006, 2007 in earnest. And at the time, there was so little on the internet. There was so little in terms of resources and people to talk to and to find. And, if you wanted to learn how to take better photos of watches, that was hopeless. You had to do it yourself. Now it just feels like there's so many fun runways where you have people who fix watches on YouTube. You have people who have entire podcasts about watches, Jason and I. You have great live events. You have fantastic retailers who really understand the enthusiast community. I think it's probably a pretty sweet time to be like kicking off the hobby. And I think the level of scholarship and kind of discord around what you could buy versus what you should buy versus what's out there is way, way stronger than it was a decade ago.
When people say, what are the best dive watches, I say it's the one you have on your wrist, etc. But I think we talk about all this justification for owning a dive watch and wearing it when diving for a backup or for functional use. But I think, as I've said before, the most important thing is really it's one of these things that we can wear 24/7. And as James said, when you're not diving, you need something to do. And if you want to look down at your wrist and have a memento of some great adventure you had, chances are all of you in the room are wearing a watch that is special to you, and maybe you wore for an interesting dive or climbing a mountain or birthing a child or whatever it might be. And I think that, to me, is the beauty of them. And I think that's the most important function of a watch these days. And maybe the advent of the dive computer has removed the need for a watch to do something more strictly functional, and can now be that. And I think that's the most valuable part of it.
That was a great summary. Thank you, everybody, for coming down here and joining us today. This has been a blast. I love seeing people down here, and I love seeing the interest in people. So now it's time where we got a little meetup happening. So enjoy yourselves for the next little while. Thank you very much, James and Jason, for joining us down here today. Really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
Yeah, let's do it in person.
So nice to see all these faces. Yeah, we got to do it in person for sure. I hope to see even some of you at either the Toronto Timepiece Show or next year's Vancouver Timepiece Show. I'm super pumped for both, and we will be at both. So hope to see you all there soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye. Have a good day.
Hello everyone, this is Jason, and I want to thank you for being with us today listening to the Roldorf Cafe Podcast. You can hear more of our shows and when they're released on Instagram and our website. We cover many topics about watches, the industry, and the brands we're most passionate about. You can find the Roldorf shop at 307 West Cordova in Gastown in Vancouver, and we'd be delighted to welcome you and talk watches. Visit our website for more information at roldorf.co.